I stood up in front of a room of developers that I'd never met and I was very intimidated by, and I asked them for their help because I couldn't do my job. And at the end of the day, a brilliant developer called Graham Tackley brought me what was called the SEO dashboard. And it did something really, really simple. It showed me the last 3 minutes of audience data from a 10% sample of the server logs. And in that moment, everything for me changed. Today, the SEO dashboard is known as OFAN, and you're seeing it on the screen right now. We believe it is the best bespoke real-time data tool in any newsroom in the world, and it is certainly the most loved and the most used. And we're rightly really proud of this product. But I am more proud of the way the product came to be. Because it's true to say that if either Graham or I hadn't been in the room that day, OFAN wouldn't have been born. But more importantly, the relationship between Graham and I that grew up in terms of sharing trust, communicating with each other, sharing expertise, is now embedded in the product team that works on OFAN. Very few platforms get to reach their 10th birthday, and very few platforms get to reach their 10th birthday after starting out as a hack. But that's the reason why. So, try and imagine you hadn't seen this. So everything I've done at The Guardian since then has been informed by a fundamental belief, and it's this, illustrated in the worst taste way I could find. And that is that editorial and product, when they're working well together, are a match made in heaven. All of the different expertise, the perspectives, the processes, and the ideas should come together to release a torrent of creativity at our best. But it's also true to say that we're not just talking here about structures or processes, we are talking about a relationship. And all of the best long-term relationships change as they go along in reaction to the way the individual partners change, and also the world around them changes too. And if you don't do that, if you don't develop your relationship, then pretty quickly it goes from looking like that to looking like something more like this. So, after 7 years as The Guardian's audience editor, I moved into a more strategic role. And this broadly describes my brief. I was using data in the newsroom in positive, responsible ways to change the way we behave for the better, but I was also increasingly working as a bridge between editorial and product. And 3 years ago, I started to realize that I was looking at the last two things with a greater sense of urgency. And the reason I was doing that was almost entirely down to a single idea that had happened in the Guardian newsroom. And it was this. 2 days after the attack on the mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, in 2019, one of the Guardian's audience editors, a man called Nick Dastor, came into the office at 7 o'clock in the morning to write the Guardian's morning audience email. This is a crucial part of the work that we do, and it goes out to the entire business, and it's a narrative that explains some of the most interesting things that we have seen in the data from the day before. And Nick's eye was drawn to this particular piece. And when he looked into it in OFAN, what he found was really interesting. It was generating not a huge amount of traffic, but a noticeable amount. All of it was coming from Facebook. It was coming from right around the world. And all of it was arriving with an incredibly short attention time. Most of the people who had clicked on it didn't stay for more than a couple of seconds. And our audience team are kind of like detectives. So Nick started to investigate. He went to Facebook to look at why people were sharing it, and he found two things very quickly. First of all, there was a huge amount of organic sharing, but it had been kicked off by two particular far-right Facebook pages. And all of the links, the posts that people were doing, looked very much like this. Most of them were saying something like, nothing on mainstream media. Now, we'll have to ignore the irony of people posting a piece from the mainstream media while saying the mainstream media aren't covering it. But the message was obvious. What they were saying was that we as journalists cared much more about the deaths of Muslims in Christchurch than we did about the deaths of Christians in Pakistan. But there's something really, really important that Nick had also noticed, and the reason why he had first started looking at this article is actually on the page, but is buried. This article was 5 years old. So, Nick realized that the far-right Facebook pages must have known this because they had to go and find this to share it in the first place. But all of the people who were sharing it afterwards had no idea that this hadn't happened on that particular day. So what we're talking about is the weaponization of quality, responsible journalism purely by virtue of the fact that Facebook didn't show a reliable date on their own platform. So what happened after that email went out was a group of us started to move towards the news desk to talk about this problem. And we came to a couple of decisions. First of all, we were going to make I'm standing in the wrong place. We were going to make the date at the article level much more emphatic, right? Which was a good thing and a hygienic thing, but it wasn't the solution to the problem because we knew that most of the people who clicked didn't stay for more than a couple of seconds. But more important, there were far more shares and views of the post on Facebook than there was referral to our own platform. And what we realized in that moment, while we were all standing around looking at this computer screen, was we realized that the answer was staring us in the face. So what you can see here on the open graph image is the fact that we, along with a number of other organizations at this time, were burning our logo onto the open graph image that the platforms use to illustrate stories. And we did that because we knew research told us that most people didn't know who the brand was when they looked at news off platform. And what we realized was we could use the same technology to do this. On older content, we could burn the year on the graph, effectively hacking the platforms in a responsible way. Thank you. It's cool. So why did I love this idea so much? Well, first of all, it was unique. Nobody else had done it, and also we were uniquely set up to notice this kind of thing through the process of the morning audience email. It was simple. We knew that this technology already worked. We had worked on it with our product and developer colleagues, and it was quick and easy to do. It was incredibly impactful because it was rooted in data right from the start. It eradicated the problem overnight, and it was widely imitated. And that was a great thing. We talked about why we had done this, and we also developed in the open, so it was easy for people to copy it. And today, this is commonplace. Right? News organizations are taking responsibility in a way that platforms are not. And that was the thing that excited me the most about this idea. It was the right thing to do, and it demonstrated that journalists have something significant to offer to the entire digital landscape. So, if this was such a great idea, why did this make me worry? And this is a bit weird, so forgive me, but this is the best way I can illustrate it. The longer I thought about this idea, the more I realized it was like a panda. And the reason it was like a panda is, first of all, it was super cute, like pandas. But secondly, and more importantly, it was really fucking hard to make more of these bastards. And I came to the realization that I really wanted to make more pandas. And I started thinking about why we weren't making more of them. And I started to think about the history of product, engineering, and journalism. And you can think about it in these two broad groups. First of all, the pre-product period, which was fertile. Nobody knew what they were doing. Everybody tried different things. It was chaotic, but it was inconsistent, and it was editor-led, usually. And then, of course, product came in as a corrective to some of those things. It normalized processes. It began to make us more rigorous and think more carefully about what we were trying to do and how we might be able to measure it. And crucially, it was user-led. But there was also something else going on. A lot of different things in the world around us. And I've just pulled out 6 which I think are interesting and relevant to this conversation. I started thinking about the tech giants and the way that they had disrupted us all those years ago, and how that led to a crisis of confidence, I thought, in terms of journalists thinking they had something useful to add to the digital landscape. I thought about the jeopardy. Stakes were getting higher and higher, and pressure was increasing on everybody. I thought about platform instability, the way in which sometimes we trusted platforms' expertise and followed them into problem areas. I'm thinking particularly of the pivot to video, but also of any news business that built their products off the back of a single algorithm, which could change at any minute. I also thought about the idea of newsroom expertise. 10 years previously, we all knew what that meant, right? It was basically writing articles. That's what editors could do. But in that 10-year period, we'd taken huge step forwards in terms of editorial digital expertise. We knew so much about audience. We were thinking about it in nuanced and contextual ways. Community, talking to our readers, including them in our journalism, visuals, and so much more. I also started thinking with optimism about the ways in which we were seeing more diverse and more interesting and more unique business models being attached to our news businesses successfully, and also in ways that suggested we were thinking about our own unique values around these problems. And finally, I was thinking about how the disruptors were now becoming disrupted. And the perfect recent example here is the way in which Instagram has responded to the challenge of TikTok in pretty unhelpful ways, I think. And it reminded me of that same crisis of confidence we had suffered all those years before. And I thought that maybe we needed to move into a new period with all of these things taken into account. And so I started thinking about the gaps between product and editorial and how we might bridge them. First of all, the long and the short term. Product teams have to work in the long term because of the priorities that they're juggling and the responsibility for all the resource that they include and use. But newsrooms are often very short-termist, and we're often terrible at talking to product about what our long-term strategic aims are. Equally, product is often challenged by people coming from the newsroom with good ideas, sparked by something that's happened in the news cycle and accommodating it. I was thinking very carefully about metrics and targets. All of that rigor that product brought with it was essential, but also we had a new understanding of what metrics could do, how they could improve journalism, how they might endanger it, and crucially, what they couldn't measure as well. I thought about this old concept of content versus product. If you showed an alien today the Facebook newsfeed and the Guardian homepage, they might conclude that they do the same job. But of course, Facebook doesn't actually care about the content that's within the containers it's showing people. It fundamentally cares about how that engages the user, but not what it's about. And the opposite is obviously true for the Guardian or any other quality news site. We don't only care about how it appears, where it appears, we create it in the first place. I thought about editorial input to product processes. Many product processes are built around the idea of a sprint team working intensively and collaboratively, usually using democratic processes to come to a successful end. But as most people who work in newsrooms know, it's almost impossible just to pick up 10 operational journalists and drop them into that sprint. And that has two impacts. First of all, the editors don't get the benefit of all of the expertise that is captured across UX, design, development, and product. And of course, equally importantly, often the journalistic voice can be missing from the conversation. Democratic processes can only work if there is equal representation. I also thought about competitor analysis, and I put analysis in quotes here because usually it is not analysis. It's a bit more like the beginning of 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the monkeys point up at the obelisk. And usually we're pointing at the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Guardian, right? And it's so important for us to look at what other people are doing and absolutely steal ideas or develop them. But too often, what we were doing with competitor analysis was actually just importing a huge number of problems that in fact belonged to somebody else, and not thinking about the problems that were unique to us. And finally, I thought about constraint. And that is, if you think about just the last 24 hours at this amazing conference and all of the brilliant people who have stood up here so far, you can go through so many different options that might be open to us. AI, audience development, business models. We're going to talk about Web 3, The problem isn't that there aren't ideas out there. The problem is that we have to be much more ruthless about the ones that really matter to us. So after all of that thinking, we started to think about structure. And this is broadly what it looked like when we were trying to get a journalistic product out into the open. We had brilliant group product managers, and we had our teams organized by platform, apps, web, and in the middle, usually you would have to deal with tools as well. The first thing was I refined my role to be Head of Editorial Innovation. And it was my responsibility, alongside our group product managers, to make sure that the input from editorial wasn't chaotic and last minute, but was considered, coherent, representative, and strategic as well. Now, one of the problems with having our product teams organized like this was the apps and the web platform teams usually had huge priorities which they were already struggling to deal with. And what that meant was that smaller, interesting ideas that were bubbling up were often impossible for them to accommodate. So we were very lucky, we had a bit of resource to invest, and we built the news experiences product team with app and web developers in there. And finally, I went around the newsroom and I tried to identify the real operational editorial experts in individual themes. And I asked them to work with me and to represent the wider organization to product when we were looking for editorial input. We also wanted to think about 3 different tracks. We wanted to tackle some big themes, but we also wanted to make sure we left room for health work, and crucially, we wanted to open up a little space in terms of agility so that we could deal with interesting, valuable ideas that naturally came through the newsroom as a result of the news cycle or observations in the data. My first job in this role was to go out into the newsroom from the bottom to the top and hear problems, frustrations, interesting ideas, passions, and so on. And we boiled all of those down to 5 big themes. And these are the ones that this team are concentrating on, and we've started with live. We also took all of those ideas and turned them into language which product teams could accommodate, understand, and work with. So, for live, we decided we wanted to help readers orient themselves in a fast-moving event and make live journalism more accessible to an audience who could find live blogs overwhelming. I don't have the time to go into detail about every change we made. But one of the interesting things about live blogs at The Guardian is we're incredibly passionate about them, and they've been at the heart of our digital success. And what we found was that our journalists were being more imaginative, interesting, and unique than we were as product people. And so what you can see here is one of our live blogs from a couple of years ago. And one of the things we were finding was the journalists were pushing against the edges of a format that couldn't really accommodate everything they wanted. And sometimes that resulted in really terrible behavior. So what you can see here is a journalist who really wants to share a bunch of related, relevant links with readers of the live blog without those links disappearing as the live blog moved down. So perfectly sensibly, they've put it in the stand first at the top of the page. Unfortunately, from a user point of view, of course, what that means is nobody can see anything that's actually in the live blog. So today, it looks more like this. We've made a huge number of changes, from the very small to the very big, to the very complicated, to the very simple. One of the most exciting new things, if I can make this pointer work, no, I can't. Obviously I can't, is here. It's difficult to read on the screen, I'm afraid. But what we're doing is we are using AI and working with our data science team to extract the topics, the biggest topics that any live blog is looking at, arrange them down the left so that it can be really easily decodable to a reader, but also we use them as filters so that any reader can immediately cut the live blog down to just what matters to them. We're really, really excited about the way we're taking this forward, but I'm more excited about the way in which this team is starting to work with the newsroom in a way that really reminds me of how the OFAN team works and the virtuous cycle that we built there. I'm nearly done. So a couple of weeks ago, in preparation for this, I went to GPT-3. If you're not familiar with it, it's OpenAI's natural language generator, and I asked it a question. I asked it to write a detailed product description for an innovative new journalism startup. And what it came back with was really fascinating. I'm not going to read it all out, because it's doggerel. But what it came back with was completely coherent, really believable, and completely lacking in any sense of character or innovation. But what was also really interesting about it was the fact that I could copy and paste that onto any innovative new journalism startup's website, and it wouldn't look out of place. Can I be heard? I can be heard. It's all right. I'm nearly there. And I think we can do better. I'm going to leave the last word to this man. This is Tony Agger. And today he is the Director of Digital at the New York Public Libraries. But for 20 years before that, he worked at the BBC, and he is one of the 2 people who are directly responsible for the creation of the BBC's iPlayer. And before that, he was the head of innovation at The Guardian. And he, along with Alan Rusbridger, was responsible for us moving very, very quickly into digital. And I had the pleasure of interviewing him last year for The Guardian. And at the end of the interview, I asked him, if he was me, what would be the piece of advice, the most important piece of advice that he could give me? And he said, more than anything, when you're thinking about developing products, remember who you are. And the more that we can inculcate that sense of what makes us unique in both editorial and product teams, the more that I'm convinced we could be on the brink of a really exciting period of creativity in digital journalism. To put it another way, let's make more pandas. Thanks for listening.